Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to discuss the principle of sufficient reason. In particular, I'll focus on an interesting recent defence of the principle of sufficient reason given by Michael Della Rocca. But first, what exactly is the principle of sufficient reason? Well, there are many ways to formulate this principle, but the basic idea is that everything must have a reason. There are no brute facts. No facts for which there is no explanation. So we can put this in a few different ways. So we might put it in terms of entities. We might say for any entity that exists, there must be a sufficient reason why it exists. We could put it in terms of truths. For any true proposition, there must be a sufficient reason why that proposition is true. We could put it in terms of facts. So for any fact, there must be a sufficient reason why that fact obtains. The debate about how exactly to formulate the principle won't really matter in what follows. The key point for us is that the principle of sufficient reason proposes unrestrained explicability. The universe is, in principle, fully explicable, fully intelligible. Now, perhaps, given our cognitive limitations, we will not be able to understand the reason why something is the case, but there is a reason all the same. If we were omniscient, we would see that all things are explicable. There are no brute facts. The principle of sufficient reason is used in a number of controversial philosophical arguments. For example, why did the universe come into existence? Some people are happy to say that there need not be any reason why this happened. The universe just popped into existence and that's that. There doesn't have to be any further explanation. The principle of sufficient reason rules out this kind of view. It demands that we explain why the universe came into existence. So, of course, that plays an important role in certain arguments for God, for example. But, what I'm going to talk about in this video is not so much how the principle has been applied, but rather, why should we believe it? As I said, so there's an interesting recent article by Michael Della Rocca in which he gives a defense of the principle. And he begins with the point that there are many contexts in which we appeal to what he calls explicability arguments. Here's one example that he gives from Archimedes. So consider a perfectly calibrated double pan balance scale. So I say perfectly calibrated in the sense that everything is the same on both sides, right? So we have a double pan balance in which everything is the same on both sides, and then two equal weights are placed on both sides. We expect that the scales will remain at rest. Why? Well, because there would be no reason why it would weigh down on one side rather than the other. If we saw the scale tip down on one side, that would just be inexplicable. Indeed, we would assume that we had understood the situation incorrectly. So we'd think, well, either the scales are actually not exactly alike on both sides, or the weights are not equal, or there is some external force interfering with the scales. But assuming that the scales are functioning properly, assuming the weights are equal, assuming there's no external force, it must be at rest. This is an explicability argument. Right? So the argument is that a certain state of affairs must not obtain, because if it did obtain, there would be no reason for it. And I think a lot of people would find this very plausible in this case, right? With respect to objects like balancers and weights, we reject inexplicability. I suppose one way to put this is that if we saw the scales shift down on one side, we would search for a reason. It wouldn't be acceptable to just shrug and call it a brute fact that, well, when equal weights are placed on these scales, the left side tips down, right? Well, no. This isn't the sort of thing that just happens for no reason at all. And there are many other everyday contexts in which we demand explicability. So suppose that an airplane crashes. Well, we're going to want to know, why did the airplane crash? Again, it wouldn't be acceptable to just shrug and call the airplane crash a brute fact. It's, to just say, well, it happened for no reason. Some set of events must have caused the crash, something about the construction of the airplane or the behaviour of the pilots or the state of the environment in which the airplane was flying and so on. There is an explanation for why the airplane crashed. So, these are some everyday contexts in which we seem to appeal to this sort of explicability. The question is, how far does this demand for explicability extend? Della Rocca considers a series of other explicability arguments. I'll mention just a few of them. So suppose there are two objects that exist in the same world and that are molecule for molecule identical. Both of these objects are the same in terms of their intrinsic categorical properties. Could these objects have different dispositions? Could it be that one of these objects has the disposition to dissolve in water while the other does not? Or could it be that one of them has the disposition to melt at 150 degrees centigrade while the other has the disposition to melt at 5,000 degrees centigrade? I mean, we're inclined to say no, right? We say no because there's nothing that could ground the difference in dispositional properties. The dispositional difference would be inexplicable, and that is unacceptable. When two objects have different dispositions, there must be a reason for this difference. There are no brute dispositions, right? So if we did find that one of these objects dissolved in water while the other did not, we would search for a difference in their categorical properties, like a difference in their molecular structure or something like that. The different disposition must be grounded in something. There must be a reason for it. Or take consciousness. We usually assume that consciousness is grounded in other properties. So if we're physicalists, for instance, we might say that whether a mental state is conscious is grounded in certain properties of the brain, a physical structure or some sort of functional process, say. Whenever a mental state is conscious, there is a reason why it is conscious, and this reason has to do with the more fundamental properties on which consciousness supervenes. There is a reason why some states are conscious and other states are not. If we deny this, we would be committed to the view that there is nothing in virtue of which a mental state is conscious. Consciousness would be inexplicable, a brute fact. And many philosophers find that just totally implausible. Consciousness isn't the kind of thing that could just obtain without anything grounding it. So there are many theories of consciousness, but all of them assume that, there is a reason for consciousness. Where a state is conscious, there is a reason why that state is conscious. Here's a final example of an explicability argument from the literature on personal identity. Derek Parfit asks us to consider the case of a person, we'll call her Verity, whose brain is split exactly in half. Each half of Verity's brain is placed into a new body, where each body is exactly identical to Verity's body. So we have person A, who has the left half of Verity's brain, and person B, who has the right half of Verity's brain, and both of them have basically the same body as Verity. Now, the question is, which of these is Verity? I mean, well, more generally, what happens to Verity? Well, it can't be that both A and B are identical to Verity, because A and B are different people, and as they go about their lives, they're going to quite radically diverge. If A were identical to Verity and B were identical to Verity, then A would be identical to B. But clearly A is not identical to B, right? So Verity can't be identical to both of them. Could it be that Verity is identical to one, but not the other? Well, Parfit says no, and this is because, so let's say we say that Verity is identical to A, but she's not identical to B. Well, Parfit says, look, that can't be the case because nothing could make A but not B identical to Verity, right? There would be no explanation for why A is identical to Verity, but B is not. Verity's identity with A would be an arbitrary brute fact, and that's unacceptable. This just isn't the kind of thing that there just couldn't be a kind of brute fact like this in this case. It couldn't. If Verity is identical to A, there must be some reason why Verity is identical to A, but there would be no reason why, given the way the case has been set up. So she can't be identical to one but not the other. Parfit's own conclusion about this case is that neither A nor B is identical to Verity. Verity ceases to exist and two new people come into existence. But the point for us is just he appears to be appealing to an explicability argument here, right? I mean, we rule out the possibility that Verity is identical to A but not B, or that Verity is identical to B but not A, on the grounds that these would just be arbitrary brute facts. These would be inexplicable. So the point of all of this is that in our everyday lives, in science and in philosophy, we regularly reason by way of explicability arguments. We assume that facts are explicable, and we conclude that certain things could not obtain on the grounds that if they did obtain, they would be inexplicable. Now, of course, none of this is to endorse the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason is a general demand for explanation. It demands an explanation for everything that there is. And obviously, these are just some specific cases where we demand explanation. So, finally, though, Della Rocca turns to an explicability argument that does entail the principle of sufficient reason, and this is the explicability argument concerning existence. For anything that exists, we can ask the question, why does it exist? So in general, as Della Rocca puts it, what is it in virtue of which things that exist enjoy existence? What explains why the things that exist exist? So just as when we have an entity that has the disposition to do F, we may ask why it has the disposition to do F. So when something exists, we may ask why it exists. We can, demand that we give an account of what it is in virtue of which that thing exists. So the existence of each thing must be explicable. That's the assumption on the table here. Now this appeal to explicability, this explicability argument, commits us to the principle of sufficient reason, because what this argument requires is just that there be an explanation for the existence of everything that exists. And that, of course, is just the principle of sufficient reason, right? If we're saying that for any entity that exists, there is an explanation for why it exists, well, that's the principle of sufficient reason. So this is so what we have then is a series of explicability arguments, and at least some of these explicability arguments are very compelling. It seems that they play an important role in our reasoning in a wide variety of contexts. But with this last step, we end up with an argument for the principle of sufficient reason. So Della Rocca says, look, we have three options here. So the first option is we could hold that no explicability arguments are legitimate. We could just reject explicability arguments across the board. The second option is we could hold that some explicability arguments are legitimate and some are not. So in particular, the explicability argument concerning existence is not legitimate. This would allow us to maintain the more intuitive explicability arguments while resisting the principle of sufficient reason. Finally, of course, we could just accept that all explicability arguments are legitimate. They're all fine. If we take the third option, we accept the principle of sufficient reason. So this option is unavailable to any critic of the principle of sufficient reason. I mean, another way to put this maybe is not so much in terms of sort of arguments, but in terms of demands for explanation, right? So we have various contexts in which we demand explanations for things. So, option one would be to hold that no demands for explanation are legitimate. Option two would be hold that some demands for explanation are legitimate and some are not. And then option three is to hold that all demands for explanation are legitimate. And of course, in the case of option three, if we say that for anything it's legitimate to demand an explanation of why that thing exists, then of course we have the principle of sufficient reason. So Della Rocca, of course, is going to argue against taking options 1 and 2. But I suppose it is worth just briefly considering whether these three options are actually exhaustive. So here's a possible alternative that we might try to take. We might say, well, maybe there's just no such thing as, an explicability argument. I mean, Della Rocca has tried to present us with a series of arguments which he thinks have a common structure, and this is supposed to lead to the explicability argument concerning existence, right? That argument has the same structure as those previous arguments, but maybe when these arguments are properly analysed, they don't really have any common structure. I mean, maybe they're not the same type of argument. So I suppose this fourth option would be to say there just is no class of explicability arguments in the first place. It's not entirely clear, though, that this would really be a genuine alternative, because even if we deny that there is a class of explicability arguments, it seems that we still need to identify some relevant difference between the argument concerning existence and the other arguments I mentioned. I mean, we have essentially a series of cases where there's some sort of demand for explanation. And of course, if you accept the demand for explanation in the case of existence, if you accept that for anything that exists, it's legitimate to demand an explanation of why it exists, then of course you end up with the principle of sufficient reason. I mean, whether you label this an explicability argument, whether there's really a sort of underlying common argumentative structure here is, I think, somewhat incidental. We still need to say why the existence argument is not legitimate, or we're going to end up committed to the principle of sufficient reason. And so that just brings us back to options 1 and 2. So with that said, then, let's turn to those. Okay, so according to option 1, no explicability arguments are legitimate. So even the everyday arguments, like the argument concerning the scales, or the argument there must be some reason why the airplane crashed, those aren't legitimate. Della Rocca doesn't deal with this option in much detail. He grants that it's consistent, but he thinks it's very unattractive. I suppose it's easy to see why. I mean, if we take this option, then you might worry that, well, everything in the universe seems to become, in an important sense, unintelligible. It may well be that there's just no reason at all why the scales tipped down on one side, no reason at all why the airplane crashed, no reason at all why these different things have different dispositions. There's just no reason for anything. Things just happen, and that's that. And of course, if you put it that way, this option sounds quite radical. But it's worth, I think, being clear that this option isn't necessarily quite as radical as that. So this option, what we're saying is we're denying that explicability arguments are ever legitimate. But it's not at all clear that this involves denying that there is ever a reason for anything. If we deny the legitimacy of explicability arguments across the board, then we will say that for any fact f, there might be no reason for f. So one way to put this is, the fact that there would be no reason for f would not in itself be any justification for thinking that f does not obtain. So all this means is that we can't argue that f does not obtain on the grounds that if f did obtain, there would be no reason for it. But this is compatible with the view that actually, in many cases, there is nevertheless a reason for f. It's just the point is that, so what we're saying basically is that for any f, there might be no reason for f, for all we know. But of course, it's consistent with that there is nevertheless actually a reason for f. So take Archimedes' scales. So we have a scale in which everything is alike on both sides, and 2 equal weights are placed on each side. If we endorse option 1, we will say that in principle, anything might happen. There is no a priori reason to expect that the scales will remain at rest. But in practice, we have a great deal of previous experience of similar objects, which has shown that when equal weights are placed on such scales, the scales remain at rest. In practice, when we see the scales tip down on one side, we find that one of the weights is heavier than the other, or that there is some external force interfering with the scales, or that the scales are actually not alike on both sides. So this, we might argue, is what is driving our demand for an explanation. Like the reason why we demand an explanation in this case is because of this previous experience. This doesn't appeal to an explicability argument. It appeals to our repeated observations of scales and objects like scales. In practice, then, of course, we look for the causes of events, and of course we look for what underlying properties constitute higher level properties. But it's questionable whether this is always motivated by explicability arguments. Della Rocca does note this response. So he suggests that sometimes we reach the conclusion that there must be a reason or an explanation, not as a result of appealing to an explicability argument, but because, as Della Rocca puts it, these conclusions cohere better with our commitments in general and have no major untoward consequences. So explicability itself provides no reason for the conclusion, but we have just other reasons, like the reason why when we look at the scales and we see the scales tip, the reason why we then search for some cause is not to do with appealing to explicability, but appealing to previous experience and background facts and so on. Now, I think that Della Rocca's response to this is, I find it a little unclear. I mean, ultimately, he seems to just insist that there are some cases where the explicability arguments are the only grounds we have for insisting on a reason, and that we can't accept that there are just brute facts in these cases. So in particular, he cites Parfit's argument concerning personal identity here. And so when we look at the case of personal identity, it doesn't really make sense to say that, you know, this is based on previous observations of cases of people who have been split in two. And I mean, in any case, it's not as though identity over time is something that's like directly observable anyway. So in this case, to suppose that verity is identical to A but not to B, that would be, as Della Rocca puts it, an intolerably brute fact. And it is on this basis alone that we reject this option, right? We have nothing else that we can appeal to reject this option. So we reject the idea that verity is identical to A but not identical to B. And why do we reject that? Well, it doesn't make sense to say that we reject it on the grounds of our previous experiences of people being split into two. That's clearly not what's going on. No, we reject it on the basis of explicability. We reject it because if verity were identical to A but not to B, there would be no reason why she's identical to A but not to B. So Della Rocca says we are appealing to explicability here. So this is a case where, the explicability argument is sort of the only grounds we have available. For what it's worth, I'll just note that my own view is that while the notion that verity is identical to A but not to B is surprising, I don't find it particularly intolerable. I mean, to me personally, I have to say I just don't find it all that absurd that it might just be a brute fact that verity is identical to A but not to B. So I'm not sure that I have the intuition to which Della Rocca is appealing here. In this case, I'm actually kind of like, if it turns out that this is just a brute fact, then okay. I mean, like I said, it's kind of surprising, but doesn't seem intolerable to me. But anyway, a quick advert. So if you like my channel, I think that would give you a sufficient reason to join my Patreon. And on the Patreon, you can access lots of bonus content. I upload bonus videos, usually about 4 a month on there. So it's about once a week. So that would also involve giving me cash to help keep the channel going. Or if you just want to give me a one-off donation, you can support me on PayPal. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. Send me an email if you're interested in that. I have a degree, master's and PhD in philosophy. So that's my background. And I have a Discord, which, you can sign up to if you want. If you want to talk to people about this stuff. Okay, so I guess that's that. Let's get back to the principle of sufficient reason. So Della Rocca spends most of his time dealing with the second option, the view that, so basically we hold that some explicability arguments are legitimate and some are not. In particular, the explicability argument concerning existence is not legitimate. So, according to this view, there is a line between the acceptable explicability arguments and the unacceptable ones. The question is, how is this line to be drawn? Well, Della Rocca says if we take this option, then we do need to find a principled difference between the legitimate explicability arguments and the illegitimate ones. The line between them can't be arbitrary. Now, I mean, we might wonder why we should accept this, right? Why not say that, well, look, some explicability arguments are legitimate, some are not, and this difference between the legitimate and the illegitimate arguments, this difference is itself inexplicable. After all, if we think that some explicability arguments are illegitimate, then perhaps the demand for an explanation of the difference between legitimate explicability arguments and illegitimate ones is itself an instance of an illegitimate explicability argument. So, perhaps it's just a brute fact that some explicability arguments are legitimate and some are not. So this, okay, why not, right? Why not take this option? Well, Della Rocca says that in this context, this would be question begging. So the critic of the principle of sufficient reason has been presented with the explicability argument concerning existence. And this argument is just an argument for the principle of sufficient reason itself. So, what's at stake here just is the principle of sufficient reason. Now suppose that the critic of the principle of sufficient reason says there's no principled difference between legitimate explicability arguments and illegitimate ones. It's just a brute fact that some explicability arguments are legitimate and some are not. Well, to appeal to a brute fact here, that simply presupposes that the principle of sufficient reason is false. So this would beg the question against the that final explicability argument concerning existence. Della Rocca concludes, and I quote, "Unless the non-rationalist can draw this principal line, she will have no way of legitimately responding to the explicability argument concerning existence, and thus no way of legitimately responding to the argument for the principle of sufficient reason." I'm not so sure, though, that this move really is question begging. I mean, I think maybe it depends on what the goal is, right? So let's say that I think that the principle of sufficient reason is false, right? I think there are some brute facts. Now, of course, if somebody presents the explicability argument concerning existence, well, you know, right, they are now putting into question the claim that there are brute facts. So they're denying that there are brute facts. So when I draw an arbitrary line between legitimate and illegitimate explicability arguments, I certainly can't expect this response to convince my opponent. But then maybe the point isn't so much to convince her. The point might just be to sort of defend my own position, to show that my own position is, rationally acceptable. So the way that we might frame my defense could be like this. Assuming that I don't already accept the principle of sufficient reason, the appeal to this series of explicability arguments gives me no reason to change my mind, because I can just deny that the explicability argument concerning existence is legitimate. So in other words, given that I already accept brute facts, the series of explicability arguments is not going to compel me necessarily. It won't necessarily compel me, because I can just take it to be a brute fact that the existence argument is not legitimate, right? Given that I already accept brute facts, I can hold that it's a brute fact that this argument is illegitimate. And I'm not really sure why that would be question begging here. It's just sort of showing that, given my assumptions, given the assumptions that I'm already making, right, I'm not going to be compelled by this argument that you're giving. Now, of course, what I say here is not going to compel my opponent, right? It's not going to give my opponent any reason to change her mind, but maybe that's not what I'm trying to do. So yeah, maybe not so obvious that this is question begging. Maybe it depends on what our goal is. I think, though, perhaps a more significant problem with drawing an arbitrary line is not so much that it's question begging, but that it's just kind of intellectually unsatisfying. So, if argument A is convincing in the sense that I say that it provides a compelling reason to believe its conclusion, and argument B is not convincing, well, yeah, surely there must be some relevant difference between A and B. If there were no difference between them, then it seems that our acceptance of argument A rather than argument B could not be due to features of the argument that are truth tracking. So, the question is, what's motivating me to accept argument A but not argument B? Well, if there's just no relevant difference between A and B, then it looks like what's motivating my acceptance of argument A must be, well, it could be all sorts of things. It could be that A confirms my biases. It could be that A is popular. It could be that A is more aesthetically pleasing. It could just be, I could just be going with A on a whim. But in any case, it's not going to be that A has, sort of the good-making features of arguments. It's not going to have features such that it tracks the truth. And so I think that, and that's a problem, because the whole point of giving arguments is to figure out what the facts are. So maybe this is why we need to identify a principled difference. If we don't have a principled difference between argument A and argument B, we can't say that argument A is the argument that's actually tracking the truth. And well, that would be a problem. That's not what we want to say. So perhaps this is a problem with just drawing an arbitrary line. Okay then, so let's turn to some attempt to draw a line between legitimate and illegitimate explicability arguments in a more principled way. Well, first of all, Della Rocca suggests that we might appeal to intuition. We have the intuition that some explicability arguments are legitimate and some are not. Thus, Della Rocca says, one can just see intuitively that explanation is needed in the other cases, but is not needed in the case of existence. In philosophy, it often seems to be the case that we ultimately rest our arguments on intuitions. And, I mean, there are approaches in epistemology which, would sort of make sense of this, would justify this. Phenomenal conservatism, for instance, says that if it seems to be the case that P, then we have defeasible reason to believe that P. And there are many kinds of seemings. One kind of seeming is the intellectual seeming of intuition. So if you have the intuition that P, then that gives you a defeasible reason to believe that P. So there are many contexts where it seems to be the case that something is in need of explanation, which gives us a defeasible reason to believe that it is in need of explanation. By contrast, there are also cases where it seems to be the case that something is not in need of explanation. So, maybe, I don't know, the question of why does the universe exist? A lot of people might say that they just, actually they have the intuition that that's just not in need of explanation. And so that would give us defeasible reason to believe that this thing is not in need of explanation. So maybe this is how we, we draw the line. Della Rocca objects that this move is also question-begging. So he grants that there is the intuition that existence is not in need of explanation, or at least some philosophers apparently have that intuition. The problem is that this intuition has been challenged by the appeal to our practice of explicability arguments. The fact that we find explicability arguments compelling in so many contexts, and that there is an explicability argument concerning existence that appears to have the same structure, gives us reason to doubt our intuition that existence is not in need of explanation. And I mean, the point is that what we have then is an argument against our initial intuition. So we can't just assume that that intuition is correct in response. After all, even people who take intuition to be reliable will grant that it provides only defeasible justification. If I have the intuition that P, this gives me reason to believe that P, in the absence of defeaters. I mean, obviously, we don't want to say that intuition is completely watertight, right? That intuition can never be overthrown. There are many cases where our initial intuitions about something turn out to be wrong. So what we have in this case is we have an argument against the initial intuition, and therefore we have an apparent defeater for that initial intuition. And that defeater will remain in place unless we can give a principled reason for treating the explicability argument concerning existence differently from the other explicability arguments. I mean, clearly it's not good enough to just insist that the difference is that we have the intuition that existence is not in need of explanation, because that intuition, the argument now provides a defeater for that intuition. So Della Rocca says that this does not work. Okay, so a second option is that we might draw the line by appealing to the unattractive consequences of the principle of sufficient reason. So, there are many objections to the principle of sufficient reason. If we accept the principle, this is going to commit us to a variety of controversial philosophical theses. In particular, there's a famous recent argument from Peter van Inwagen and Jonathan Bennett that the principle of sufficient reason commits us to necessitarianism, the view that everything is necessary. All truths are necessary truths. The argument goes like this. Consider the conjunction of all contingent truths. So call that C. If the principle of sufficient reason is true, there must be a sufficient reason for C. And we'll call that R, right? So R must be the reason for C. Now, is R necessary or contingent? Well, suppose that R is necessary. Well, if R is sufficient for C, this is just to say that it's not possible that R could be the case while C fails to be the case. So if R is necessary and R is sufficient for C, then C must also be necessary. And if C is necessary, then all of the conjuncts of C are necessary. But C then can't be the conjunction of all contingent truths, right? I mean, we've said, look, C is the conjunction of all contingent truths, but, if R is necessary and R is the sufficient reason for C, then, you've made C necessary and therefore you no longer have contingent truths. So, okay, that doesn't work. R can't be necessary. All right, well, assume then that R is contingent. Well, in that case, since C is the conjunction of all contingent truths, R must be a conjunct of C. But if R is the sufficient reason for C and R is part of C, then R is the sufficient reason for itself. But surely contingent truths can't be self-explanatory in this kind of way. A contingent truth can't be the sufficient reason for itself. So R cannot be contingent. So we have it that R cannot be necessary and R cannot be contingent. And since those are the only options, what this means is that R cannot exist. There cannot be any reason for the conjunction of all contingent truths. I mean, and so obviously, if the principle of sufficient reason is true, well, the only way to make this consistent is to say that there cannot be any contingent truths. All truths must be necessary. This is a pretty radical conclusion. All truths are necessary. It is a necessary truth that I am currently recording a video on my computer. I mean, we usually assume that I could be doing something else. Like I could have chosen to go eat dinner or read a book or go to the beach or play didgeridoo. Like I could be doing all sorts of other things instead of what I'm doing right now. The necessitarian denies this. It is impossible for me to be doing anything other than what I am actually doing. It is impossible for things to be any way other than the way they actually are. Most philosophers see this as a hopelessly implausible conclusion. So this is how we draw the line between explicability arguments. The legitimate explicability arguments are the ones that have, are the ones that are sort of compatible with reasonable views. The illegitimate explicability arguments are the ones that have these implausible consequences, such as necessitarianism. That's a problem for the existence argument that none of the other arguments have. Like when we demand an explanation in the case of the scales, well, that doesn't entail necessitarianism. When we demand an explanation for each thing that exists, well, that's just the principle of sufficient reason, and therefore that's going to entail necessitarianism. So what does Della Rocca say about this? Well, actually, so Della Rocca just accepts that the principle of sufficient reason entails necessitarianism, but then he argues as follows, I quote, "Precisely because necessitarianism is an implication of the principle of sufficient reason, the intuitive pressure leading to the principle of sufficient reason is intuitive pressure leading to necessitarianism." So basically, the explicability argument concerning existence is, as an argument for the principle of sufficient reason, thereby an argument for necessitarianism. So basically what we're doing is we are presenting an argument for necessitarianism, and so we can't, in this context, just assume that necessitarianism is false, right? It's like, once somebody has presented an argument for necessitarianism, it would obviously beg the question to assume that necessitarianism is false. So yet again, I think Della Rocca would say this is actually just question begging. So yeah. I think, though, we might worry about Della Rocca's response here. I mean, okay, maybe Della Rocca is happy to embrace necessitarianism, but I think that, the question is, the principle of this response. I mean, in principle, surely the principle of sufficient reason could have consequences which are such that we would judge it to be genuinely unacceptable. So suppose, for instance, it turned out that the principle of sufficient reason entailed trivialism. Trivialism is the view that all propositions are true. All of them, right? So any proposition you care to name is true, according to trivialism. Very few philosophers defend trivialism, and I mean, as far as most philosophers are concerned, if a philosophical position entails trivialism, then that in itself is going to be a reason to reject that philosophical position. And I mean, I don't know what Della Rocca thinks about this, but it wouldn't surprise me if he would have that view as well. I mean, so, I doubt he would say that, well, precisely because trivialism is an implication of the principle of sufficient reason, the intuitive pressure leading to the principle of sufficient reason is intuitive pressure leading to trivialism, so now we just have an argument for trivialism. I mean, the proper response, if the principle of sufficient reason entails trivialism, the proper response is to reject the principle of sufficient reason. The proper response is whenever an argument leads us to trivialism, we just reject that argument. We don't embrace trivialism. So, if the explicability argument concerning existence entailed trivialism, that would in itself be a good enough reason to reject that argument, and then that would be a way to draw the line between legitimate and illegitimate explicability arguments. And I suppose really this is just a point that was made by G.E. Moore with his Moorean shift, right? Philosophical arguments are essentially invitations to compare plausibility, right? Suppose that you have let's say you give a valid argument for a conclusion, right? So you have a set of premises, and those premises lead to some conclusion. You've got like premise 1, premise 2, etc., conclusion. It's always possible for another philosopher to come along and deny the conclusion and then infer that one of the premises is false. So we can say, so essentially, right, the first philosopher says P1, P2, P3, etc., and then C is the conclusion. But then the other philosopher comes along and says, not C, therefore not P1 or P2 and P3 and etc. Now, it seems like, so that's a sort of move that we can always make. And then the question is just, well, what's more plausible? Is it more plausible to accept P1, P2, etc., or is it more plausible to deny the conclusion? Now, I think if we show that the explicability argument concerning existence entails trivialism, I mean, yeah, maybe somebody might take that to be a successful argument for trivialism. I think the vast majority of philosophers would infer that something has gone wrong with the argument. We would reject trivialism and infer that one of the premises is false. That kind of Moorean shift move is, in principle, always available to us. So, I mean, I guess then the question is, right, if it's acceptable to make this move when the consequence is trivialism, why shouldn't it be acceptable to make that move when the consequence is necessitarianism? Now, I mean, obviously, I suppose most philosophers would say that necessitarianism is not as absurd as trivialism. But perhaps we think that necessitarianism is still far less plausible than the denial of a set of philosophical premises that support necessitarianism. So if an argument leads to necessitarianism, that gives us reason to reject the argument. I mean, maybe that reason can be overcome. Maybe we can analyze the argument and show that it's actually watertight. And, so we might well end up thinking that, like, okay, we do have reason to take necessitarianism seriously. But still, the fact that an argument implies necessitarianism is going to count against it. And so we have a reason to reject the explicability argument concerning existence. This is and this is a principled line, a line between the legitimate explicability arguments and the illegitimate ones. This could still leave us, incidentally, with a more limited demand for explicability. So we might endorse the following sort of principle. For anything that exists, we have defeasible justification for believing that there is a sufficient reason why it exists. This is not the principle of sufficient reason, but arguably it does much the same job as the principle of sufficient reason in that it accounts for our practice of forwarding explicability arguments. So, the explicability arguments concerning the scales, concerning dispositions, concerning consciousness. For all of these things, right, we have a defeasible justification for believing that there is a reason why these things are the way they are. But where explicability leads to unwelcome conclusions, such as necessitarianism, we have a defeater. So we would not then accept the demand for explanation in those cases. So the explicability in ordinary cases, like the scales, is fine, but it has its limits, and the limits are where it ends up entailing these unwelcome conclusions. Okay then, here's another option for the person who holds the view that there is a line between acceptable and unacceptable explicability arguments. So we could argue that there is a principled line between the legitimate and the illegitimate arguments, but that we just don't know exactly how that line is to be drawn. I mean, there's all sorts of things that we don't yet know, right? There's lots of facts that we don't know, and philosophy still has a long way to go. Philosophy and other areas of inquiry still have a long way to go. So why shouldn't it just be that, you know, look, yeah, there's a line, right? I'm gonna argue that there is a principled line, but I just don't know how to draw it. Why isn't that an acceptable move here? And maybe we could also appeal to the previous response and say, well, look, the fact that the principle of sufficient reason has such counterintuitive consequences, that suggests that there is indeed a principled line, even if we can't yet identify exactly where that line is or exactly what grounds that line, exactly what grounds the difference between the legitimate and illegitimate explicability arguments. So along similar lines, we don't know how to draw the line between people who are bald and people who are not bald. There are various vague cases, people who have a little hair but not that much hair, and we're unsure exactly how to classify them, but we're still capable of easily identifying people who are clearly bald and people who are clearly not bald. So there's the famous Socrates argument, right? Like, Ian is bald. If X is bald and Y has one hair more than X, then Y is bald. Stephen has one hair more than Ian, thus Stephen is bald. And of course, this argument can be repeated until we reach the conclusion that Jamie, who has a full and luscious head of hair, is also bald. Now, none of us would accept this conclusion, right? But yeah, I mean, when we look at that, we might think, yeah, I don't know how to draw a principled line between Ian and Jamie. Still, we know that there is a way to draw this distinction. We know that the Socrates argument goes wrong somewhere. So why not say the same about the explicability arguments? Some explicability arguments are clearly legitimate, like the argument concerning the scales. Some explicability arguments are clearly not legitimate, such as the existence argument that commits us to necessitarianism. Okay, we can't draw a principled line between these arguments. Still, we know that this slide from the everyday explicability arguments to the existence argument, we know that that goes wrong somewhere. So in response to this, Della Rocca says that there is an important disanalogy. In the case of baldness, it doesn't matter whether we can draw a principled line because we can get away with just drawing an arbitrary line. Drawing an arbitrary line between bald and non-bald people doesn't beg any questions. So we can just reject the premise that if X is bald and Y has one hair more than X, then Y is bald. That premise is not going to be universally true because there will be an arbitrary point at which you move from bald to non-bald. By contrast, we can't draw an arbitrary line with respect to explicability arguments. As we've seen, that begs the question, or so Della Rocca says. Drawing an arbitrary line assumes that it's just a brute fact that some explicability arguments aren't legitimate. But, whether they're a brute fact is precisely what the argument for the principle of sufficient reason puts into question. I do wonder, though, whether Della Rocca's response here really deals with the point being made by the objector. I mean, the idea is not, at least as I read it, the idea is not so much that, we can draw an arbitrary line between explicability arguments. That's not the point. The idea is there might well be a principled line, but that we just don't know where the line is. So our inability to draw a principled line does not entail that there is no principled line. I mean, maybe the analogy to baldness is a little bit misleading here, because in the case of baldness, I suppose it does sort of feel like, yeah, maybe that line is just going to be completely arbitrary, that there isn't going to be any principled way of splitting one from the other. But what's being said here is, no, there is a principled line between these arguments, but we just don't know it. Perhaps we will say, look, it's more plausible to hold that there is a principled line, though we don't yet know where that line is, than to hold the principle of sufficient reason, especially bearing in mind the counterintuitive consequences of the principle of sufficient reason, such as necessitarianism. I suppose, the question is, what's wrong with taking this more sceptical attitude? Not everything in philosophy has been solved yet. There are lots of problems still open, and I wouldn't expect that everything in philosophy is going to get solved in my lifetime. I wouldn't even expect that everything in philosophy will be solved in the next 1,000 years. So, the idea that, like, well, maybe maybe we're just sort of in the dark about where this line is, where the principled line is, right? Maybe there is a principled line, but we're in the dark about it. Maybe we just don't have the sort of relevant conceptual theoretical development to state this line. Seems perfectly plausible to me. But anybody who takes this more skeptical attitude is obviously not going to feel compelled to embrace the principle of sufficient reason. And I mean, look, I don't think this is a particularly unusual move in philosophy. Sometimes we are quite confident that an argument goes wrong somewhere, even though we can't identify exactly where the mistake is. In response to Anselm's ontological argument, we might be persuaded that Gournilo's perfect island objection shows that the argument goes wrong, but we might just be agnostic about which step exactly goes wrong. It seems to me that if Della Rocca wants to give a sort of a compelling case for the principle of sufficient reason, or a case that's going to be compelling to a broad variety of people, he's going to have to show that this sort of skepticism is unacceptable in this case. So with that said, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you found that interesting, and I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.